In the wake of the Paris attacks, the backlash against Muslim communities is as bad or maybe even worse than it was after 9/11. First, the House passing legislation to lock down the country to Syrian refugees, all of them, and comments from Donald Trump and many others, to be honest, that Muslims maybe should be monitored and registered. Our next guests are here to shed some light on what all of this is doing to Muslim communities and have some frank talk. We have Farhana Khera, the Executive Director of Muslim Advocates, and Haroon Moghul, a Senior Correspondent for Religion Dispatches and a Fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Let's just have the dialogue. I hear it all the time. I hear the fear. I hear what the resistance is on both sides. So let's just enable a conversation, Haroon. The starting premise is this. The President of the United States won't even say what this is. He won't say that they're Muslims. He won't say that it's Islamist terror. He won't. He's hiding. He's placating. What do you say?
Just today, a few minutes ago maybe, a Turkish plane shot down a Russian airplane. Turkey's a NATO ally. What people don't seem to get is that we're fighting ISIS alongside Muslims. So what does it gain us as a country to alienate our allies when we need them in a fight? People who stood behind us before, Turks fought alongside Americans in the Korean War. They chose to, they didn't have to, they volunteered. And we're just going to go and say that all of you are bad just because some of you are bad? That's the thing that's dangerous to me, that this is bad for us from a national security perspective.
Farhana, when you say, I didn't say Muslim terror, that they're all Muslim, well, even though, if you identify as Muslim, then that's what you have to be taken as. But why can't the president say Islamist or Islamism, terrorism, extremism, within those groups? Why can't we be accurate to what the groups identify themselves as?
Well, Chris, let me first say that I, like all Americans, believe that, violence, whatever its source, we need to be kept safe from that violence. And I certainly share the level of fear and anxiety that I think a lot of Americans have. I actually was just traveling in Brussels with my family this summer. So as these images are flashing across our screens, it hits home for me. I think, going to your question, though, I think the key thing here, and what I find troubling as a Muslim, is that by constantly referring and using Islamic terms, we're actually reinforcing their messaging. They want this to be a war of the West versus Islam, but this isn't. This is a war about civilized society against, frankly, a death cult, and I think that's what the real concern is.
Well, you know what the concern is on the pushback? It is that he's trying to protect, he and these other lefties, they're trying to protect these Muslims because they're afraid of them, and he doesn't want to be honest and say what the truth is, which is these are Muslims. But in truth, I have many Muslim people in my life. I feel very lucky that way. And they say, listen, I'm fine with calling these guys, just call them the right thing. Just say they're Islamist, extreme Islamists, and that's fine because that's different than my faith. That's different than my mainstream Islam. Is that a meaningful distinction to you?
It is, but I think that there's a distinction between security and bigotry, and we're not making that distinction for two reasons. One, because a lot of the voices who are calling for all these measures against Muslims, against Syrian refugees, will not do the same thing about gun violence, mass shootings, white supremacist or racist groups. There's a double standard at work.
You know what they say is, the gun battle doesn't result in somebody wanting to chop my head off. That's the problem. Even when you talk about the Crusades and Christians, people say, yeah, but this is going on right now, and these guys are trying to chop our heads off. How can you compare them to the KKK or anything else? Nobody's this bad.
But it's worse than that. So Chris Christie comes out and says that not even a 3-year-old Syrian refugee,
yes,
there's no better illustration that Islamophobia is racism. You're saying that a 3-year-old kid with no parents who's raised in a completely different context and culture is nevertheless going to grow up to be a terrorist. What you're saying, in effect, is that being an Arab and Muslim is a kind of genetic condition, and there's no escaping it. And so even someone who has, literally has been abandoned by the world and is too young to know what's going on is still a threat to our country.
So what do you do with that? This is like, the only way I can relate to this is when I'm trying to process this is I remember growing up as a kid in Queens where everybody assumed if you were Italian, you were in the mafia. But we just dismissed it as stupidity. But now you have it where there's a danger attached to it, Farhana. When you hear the thousands and thousands of you people were celebrating as the towers came down, how do you hear those words and how do you want to respond to them?
So you're absolutely right, Chris. Frankly, the reckless and irresponsible anti-Muslim rhetoric that we're hearing from public officials is actually dangerous, and it's contributing to a very toxic environment in which the signal that's being sent to the American people that it's frankly open season to harass, attack, and discriminate against American Muslims. But that's not who we are as Americans. What the core values of who we are is a commitment to freedom, religious freedom, and that there's strength in our diversity. From all different faith and racial backgrounds, we come together, and our diversity is our strength as a country. And so what we need at this time, especially this difficult time for Americans and for our country, is for public officials from both sides of the aisle to step forward and to actually not engage in this kind of divisive rhetoric. And I might add that it's not just public officials, but all Americans. I think this is the time to step up. Americans like Green Bay Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers, who made a point of calling out a fan who had yelled out "death to Muslims." And so I just really applaud people like Aaron Rodgers, our interfaith allies who've been stepping up and standing with the American Muslim community in the last week.
I get and I hear from people, it can be a little frustrating when it takes a football quarterback to make an impact on the dialogue. But you know what? Leaders come in many forms and from different sectors, especially in American society, and we're always happy to have this conversation because it's got to yield some understanding. We can't stay the way it is right now. Farhana Khera, thank you very much. Haroon Moghul, always a pleasure. Pleased to both of you. A happy Thanksgiving. So.